Okay, let's talk a little bit about the next philosophy of mind we're going to cover in this section, reductive materialism. There are various types of materialist philosophies of mind, and what we mean by materialism here is that the only stuff that exists is material, matter, energy, or physical stuff, right? So there's another type of materialist philosophy of mind called eliminative materialism, but the book that we're using this semester focuses on reductive materialism. So like I've mentioned before, there are lots and lots of different ways to articulate any generic or general philosophical position, and many different arguments that might be given for that position. And here we're just looking at reductive materialism and one argument for it, as well as a couple of criticisms of this view as well, a couple of common criticisms of this view. So let's get started here. So as I just mentioned about materialism or physicalism, this is a metaphysical view, and it's the view that the only kinds of stuff that exist is physical stuff, right? So material, matter. So when I talk about materialism here, I don't mean the desire to buy lots of things and have lots of material possessions or something like that. I mean the view that the only stuff that exists, it's what makes it a metaphysical view, is matter or matter energy. So we've got two basic pillars of materialism. The first is the power of scientific explanation. If you look at the history of scientific explanation, it always looks for a material cause or a natural cause in the world as a mechanism for explaining things or as the cause of things. And then the second pillar of materialism is Occam's razor, which is this notion that the simplest explanation is most likely the correct explanation or the best explanation. So I don't mean by simplest, the easiest one for me to understand or any particular person to understand. I mean the idea that a theory is as simple or as elegant as possible. In other words, it doesn't multiply or add assumptions beyond necessity. And so materialism is one assumption or one principle, one premise, you might think about it that way, simpler than substance dualism, the other theory that we've covered in this section. It says there's two kinds of stuff, and as we saw there, it left us with the problem of trying to articulate the precise nature between a non-physical mind and a physical body, right? Even though that's the mind-body problem, it looks like substance dualism has a hard time accounting for that precise interrelationship between those two things. And the objections that we looked at to substance dualism seem to press us or move us in the direction of another theory, one that would say, look, let's get rid of this talk about the mind or the idea that the mind is a non-physical thing, even if you still want to refer or use the word mind. What the materialist is saying, what we need to do, no matter how we're speaking about it, is to realize that that we're talking about physical stuff, right? The brain and its central nervous system, basically, material stuff. So one movie in particular that we find that has this view in it is a movie called Replicas where Keanu Reeves, he plays a neuroscientist. And in the movie, he says that we're the sum total of what happened to us and how we processed it. That's what makes us us. It's all neurochemistry. And that's a pretty good pop culture reference or statement of this idea of reductive materialism. So again, this is the view. Here's a little bit more technical of a definition of it. The theory or the philosophy of mind that any mental state, right, or mental process for that used to traditionally be described as a non-physical thing, right, is really identical to some brain and or central nervous system state. So sometimes it's called identity theory for that reason. So remember, Leibniz's law is very important here. Once again, it's saying that any mental state is identical to some physical state, right? And so if we could find a violation of that notion that some essential property of the person is not reducible to, like consciousness or our thoughts, right, is not reducible to some physical state, then this theory would have a problem. Your textbook doesn't include any selections from a reductive materialist, at least this version of the textbook, but I've pulled out a few quotes from a philosopher who articulates this position. I won't read through all the quotations. I feel like I've fallen into a trap there with some of the lecturing there. Since they're in the notes, you can read through them. What I'll do is go through the key ones and paraphrase them. But what he begins with is this notion, remember interactionism from substance dualism. How is it the non-physical mind interacts with the physical body? Well, he says, look, when we rejected that, when we saw the problems with interactionism, it seems like a natural move, as I was mentioning earlier, to adopt some kind of materialist view. But he says, look, we should recall the reasons why we were tempted to embrace dualism in the first place. And he says there's two different ones. First, that mental objects or mental activity seems to be private. I only have access to it. So again, think of cogito ergo sum, Descartes' cogito, right? Only I have access to my thoughts, right? Only Descartes knew that he was a thinking thing. Only I know that I'm a thinking thing, right? So he says, the first reason we were tempted to adopt a dualist position in the first place is the privacy of those mental objects. And secondly, that mental objects can't have the same qualities or properties. And what we're worried about, of course, there's essential properties, right? As physical objects have. So it says thoughts, wishes, fears can't have any size or shape. They don't have any dimensions to them. And so they can't be physical things, right? And now the identity theorist responds to that stuff by saying, look, no one can see your thoughts because there aren't really any thoughts there. They're not objects, right? So one way of setting up the mind-body problem is to think of the mind as an object or something like this, and the body as another object. But the reductive materialist has kind of this crazy sounding idea here. They say that they don't exist, that our thoughts don't really exist. Now that sounds preposterous, right? Because you're thinking to yourself, well, look, the most real thing to me are my own thoughts and so forth, my own emotions, right? I have immediate access to those. So how could they not be, real? Well, here's the response, the reductive materialist response to that kind of objection. And he notes here that at first glance, this seems preposterous, right? To deny the idea that mental objects or mentality exists in any way. So how is it that the reductive materialist responds to that kind of suggestion that notion's absurd? They say, well, look, they're not objects, they are events, they are happenings or occurrences. So he uses this example of kicking a football, right? Well, the kick is, we talk about it like it's a noun, right? But it's really an event. It's really a verb, right? And so is our mind. That's really what the idea is here. So there are no objects that are thoughts. They don't have size and shape the way, say, this pillow that I'm holding. Well, you can't see it in the monitor there. Here, let me hold up a pen, right? This pen has an object, has an independent, it takes up size, and it has a location, right? But my mind doesn't do that. My thoughts don't do that. So maybe that looks a little less preposterous now. What he's saying is that those are events or happenings rather than objects, right? So he says, what's the difference then between talking about the mind or mental processes or consciousness as an event rather than an object? He says, an event is a happening. It's an occurrence. So we talk about the mind sometimes as if it is a thing, right? But it's really not. It's really more like a verb, right? To have consciousness is not to have a thing, it's to do something, or for our bodies to perform some kind of function. So remember the quote from Keanu Reeves, it's how we process stuff. That's what the mind is. So he says, so of course a scientist, or anybody else for that matter, can't poke around your brain and find certain thoughts or the dream that you had last night or any of those sorts of things, because they don't really exist as objects, right? Thus, the privacy of the mind, he says, is really an illusion. Mental objects really aren't private. They don't really exist as objects. They're really brain processes. Right? And so he says, and in fact, whole bodies of science have developed over the last 50 years or so, right? Along this, neuroscience being one of them. Of course, there's biology of the brain and all neurochemistry and all this sorts of stuff, right? That goes into neuroscience. And he says, look, the discoveries of that science is that what we see is that the brain has certain kinds of activity in it, And that those regions of the brain that perform that activity, that corresponds to some kind of mental event. Like, so if I have pain, if I'm experiencing pain, then there's a certain kind of process going on in my physical body, my brain and central nervous system. So he says, let's say that whenever I feel a particular sort of pain, there's a particular sort of firing in my brain, the neurons, right? Wouldn't the simplest explanation of this be, notice the appeal to Occam's razor there, that the correspondence really is identical with the firing of those synapses, right? That consciousness of pain or the mental process or mental event is really just identical to the physical processes going on in my brain and central nervous system. And so from those basic ideas, once again, we can get a basic argument for reductive materialism using, again, just our very basic argument forms that we've learned. So let's call this the correspondence argument for reductive materialism, because it's based on this idea that there's a correspondence between my body, right, and having a certain kind of mental state or a mental event going on with me, consciousness being the main one, right? So based on the correspondence between the physical and the mental, shouldn't we just think or reason then that the mental state, right, or having a mind is really identical to the firings of the central nervous system and the brain? So pause here and get some practice trying to reconstruct that argument, and then unpause the video and you can take a look at how I reconstructed it. All right, so hopefully you took a shot at that, right? If you really want to get the most out of the class and learn that basic skill, you need to try to practice reconstructing arguments. And of course, that's a good thing to practice just for some of our course requirements. But here's how I reconstructed the argument. So I said, if mental states correspond to a brain or central nervous system states, then mental states are identical to those brain and central nervous system states. And of course, we have evidence from the empirical sciences, right? So here's a way in which philosophy is making use of empirical information, right? So mental states, pain, for example, corresponds to certain activity in my central nervous system, the firing of the synapses, right? And the neurons moving. Thus, mental states are identical to those physical states. So there's a basic argument, the correspondence argument for reductive materialism. Now, of course, we're worried about some basic criticisms of this. And these are, again, some influential criticisms, right? So one of them is that we can call it the intentionality objection. So intentionality is this idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's directed at things. So for example, right now, my consciousness is directed at the information that I'm trying to present. It's also directed at certain things in my physical environment, right? But the idea of the intentionality objection is that bodily states don't have intentionality. So they can't be identical, that all that's going on in my mental life then can't be reduced to a physical state. Or in other words, we have a violation of Leibniz's law at that point. Another objection, and I'll spend more time on this one, is the qualitative content objection. And this notion is that a part of my conscious life, and anybody's conscious life, seems to be that it has a qualitative aspect to it. There is a subjective dimension to my experience of the world. Right now, I'm a little bit warmer, for example, than I was earlier. My wife is in the other room, and she's kind of chilly right now. So we have the subjective dimension to our experience or our consciousness. Well, that has a first-person aspect to it. That's really the key thing here, is that subjective or qualitative content has a first-person aspect to it. Well, how can we account for that first-person aspect of consciousness in third-person objective terms, right? If we're going to claim that neuroscience is really going to solve the mind-body problem and that we're going to be able to reduce, as reductive materialism claims, all mental phenomena to a physical phenomenon, then that would mean that all mental phenomena really are observable to from anyone from a third person standpoint, right? That's what science does. It looks and observes things from a third person standpoint. Picking up on that notion, let's consider this thought experiment for a second. This is Nagel's bat. I also have an example with the neurosurgeon But this comes from a famous essay by Thomas Nagel. He's an influential philosopher that criticized materialist philosophies of mind. That's one of the things he's known for, with this bat thought experiment. He's talking about like a flying bat, right? Coming up on Halloween, at least at the time of the recording of this, we got about a month till Halloween. And we're going to, so bat references, right? Halloween. So he says, I assume bats have experience. After all, they're mammals, so there's no reason to doubt that. And we know that most bats perceive the external world through echolocation, or like a sonar-like thing. They chirp and then bounce back, and sound waves bounce back after their chirp, and they are able to make discriminations of size and distance and all sorts of things like that. And then he says, but what I want to know is what it's like for the bat to be a bat, not what it would be like for a human being to approximate bat experience, but what would it like to be a bat in the first person sense, or the first bat, from the first bat perspective, the first person perspective. And his idea is that that qualitative content, that first person standpoint, is in your mind in a way that is different than your brain being inside your head. So we have his idea is that you can't really know what it's like to be a bat, right? So we have another violation of Leibniz's law there. And then here's another example that comes from Nagel with a neurosurgeon, right? So think of how certain foods taste to you, right? So the neurosurgeon is operating on you. She's learning all there is possible to know about the brain. You're the experiment subject, and they're using your brain to learn everything possible about the brain. And at the end of these surgeries, they hand you a piece of chocolate and they ask you how it tastes. You say it's yummy, of course. And the neuroscientists can see the parts of the brain that light up when you taste the chocolate, but they can't observe how the chocolate tastes to you, that first person aspect, right? So he says, if what happens in your experience is inside your mind in a way that what happens in your brain is not, it looks as though your experiences and other mental states can't just be physical states of the brain. There has to be something more to you than your body and your central nervous system. So again, we got Leibniz here saying that Nagel saying that there's a violation of Leibniz's law involved in that, that correspondence argument for reductive materialism. So we've got the reductive materialist argument. Here's Nagel's thought experiment and his point about those two thought experiments formulated as an argument. So we'll just call this Nagel's argument against reductive materialism, or against materialism, really. It's not just reductive materialism. He's taking aim at really any kind of materialist philosophy here. And so I've got physical events can be adequately described objectively, and mental events, first-person experiences, cannot be adequately described objectively. Right? If physical events can be adequately described objectively, then mental events cannot be so adequately described. And physical events are not identical to mental events. Thus, physical events are not identical to mental events. Right? So again, this is a good spot to pause and start thinking about the back and forth between these positions and the argument back and forth between them. Assume for the sake of argument that Nagel is correct. Which premise is he taking aim at in the correspondence argument? And what kind of error is he pointing out there? And of course, it's going to make use of Leibniz's law, as I've already indicated. Now, we might think that because Nagel is criticizing materialist philosophies of mind, he's going to go back to some kind of substance dualism, but he doesn't do that. Nagel is known for espousing instead, or developing, this theory of property dualism. And this is the view that human beings are material, right? But the brain has two different aspects to it. So it's sometimes called dual aspect theory. It has both physical and non-physical aspects or characteristics to it, such that the mental characteristics aren't reducible to the physical, even if the physical is generating them. So you might wonder, well, what's the difference between property dualism and substance dualism then? Well, in principle, substance dualism says that you could have a mind without a body, right? Those are, although they're intermingled to make up the human person that we are used to thinking about, that the mind is really separable from the body. And so if you remember Descartes' methodological doubt, when he says he's a thinking thing, he doesn't have a body at that point. So the idea is in principle that at least that your mind could survive the death of your body in some way, or that your soul, if that's what you think of as consciousness, could somehow survive the death of your body. But property dualism denies that. It says that if you took away the body, that the mind would go as well. It's just that the mind is not reducible to the body for the reasons that we just saw in Nagel's argument there. So that's a little warm-up lecture on reductive materialism. Again, if you have questions about what we covered here, hit me up on email or in the discussion forums or in the class chat periods. All right, I hope everybody's doing well. Y'all take care. And the next lecture up is on functionalism. So look for that one next.